So we're going to kick things off. We got Mike Seymour with Seymour Consulting, and today we're going to talk about some new HIPAA and CMMC rules. Um, this topic is, ever becoming everly more critical, even more critical for us. Um, Security, compliance can be a practice all of its own, and but it's just critical for us as MSPs to be able to stay on top of the latest changes with rules and regulations. And with that being said, we have a expert on the subject. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Dan. Good to be with you today.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. It's been a little bit, a hot minute since we've had you on, and glad to have you back with us. And before we get started, if you could give, like a 1 minute, overview of who you are, just what you do today and what your history has been as an MSP.
Sure. It's hard to squeeze into a minute, but I'll do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Mike Semmel, and I'm a recovering MSP. And people ask me when I became an MSP, and I can't tell them. And the reason for it is I was in the industry long before the term MSP was even being used. We started back in the late 70s as one of the early Apple dealers. And my company went through all the different iterations. We were retail, we were business to business, and then we went from break fix, which we didn't know was a term at that point, over to managed services. So I was an MSP, and I learned about compliance at an Ingram event from another MSP, and it hit me like a ton of bricks and said, wow, they're going to regulate the entire healthcare industry. This was HIPAA way back in 2004. And we changed our messaging. First of all, I went out and got some training. So I knew the HIPAA language. And then we remarketed ourselves. We didn't, I mean, the marketing engine stayed the same. I mean, we were still doing, email campaigns and getting people interested in us. But our messaging changed and said that we were compliance specialists. We weren't experts, we were specialists. And that changed the whole game because all of a sudden we were getting calls from CEOs and CFOs and people like that at organizations saying, we've got these new compliance requirements. Can you help us? And under the skin, we were doing all the same services as MSPs, but we were calling them compliance services. And we were painting them with a compliance brush to say, this is how our services help you comply, as opposed to this is how it protects data. So those are the things that we've done that are different than other MSPs. I've also been the chief information officer for a hospital and for a K-12 school district, and I've been a consultant for the last 12 years, not selling any IT products and services, but doing compliance projects. And now I'm a CMMC certified assessor.
Excellent. And we're going to go ahead and kick things off. You can share your screen. And for everybody, just in traditional format for WTF Wednesdays, Mike will jump in and chat for about 10, 15 minutes on this topic. And then we'll open it up to open discussion. And so at that point, you'll be able to, ask any questions that you have and go from there. So with that being said, I'll let you take over, Mike.
Hey, Dan, thanks. So I'm assuming you can see my screen, correct?
Yes, correct. Yep.
Good. So what we're going to talk about today are compliance opportunities and challenges. They're both, but it's just like everything in business. We have business opportunities and challenges. I'm going to be pushing that 15-minute mark, and I may go over a few minutes. And if I do, I'm going to stay on as long as you guys have questions. So I'm not going to jump off of here. And I know, Dan, you probably have things scheduled, but I'll be glad to stay on and answer the questions.
Sure.
So the first thing is just to make sure that we kind of agree on terminology and where I'm coming from. Cybersecurity is not compliance. They're two different things. Cybersecurity, we know, is protecting data against loss, theft, and unauthorized access. Doesn't matter what you do. That's generally, what you're doing cybersecurity for. But compliance is different. Cybersecurity protects the data. Compliance is everything someone else makes you do. And the reason I say that is when I ask people, MSPs, tell me about compliance, they want to talk about HIPAA, they want to talk about CMMC, but it's everything. Think about the word everything, not something, but everything someone else makes you do. And what are those requirements in our industry? Well, the first one would be federal and state laws. HIPAA, state data breach laws, state regulations for insurance companies, cybersecurity, and things like that. Industry requirements, which are different than laws because they come from a different type of organization. For example, PCI for payment card security, PCI stands for payment card industry. It's not a law, it's a law within that industry, but it's not a law that was passed by a legislature, signed by a governor or the president or anything like that, but it's a requirement for businesses that accept payment cards. Contracts, and we're seeing this more and more. Just had a client send me a contract that they're an insurance agent. They wanted to work with a new underwriter, big company that actually underwrites the insurance. First requirement in the contract was you need an annual SOC 2 report. I sent it back to him and said, well, if you want to pay 50 grand every year, you can work with these guys. They're negotiating that out of the contract. But there were still another 3 pages of cybersecurity requirements that they can meet. We're finding this, and sometimes they're hidden in contracts that were filed away. Cyber insurance, we all know about cyber insurance, but when you fill out that policy application, you're committing yourself to doing those things. And all of this stuff stacks up. So if you're a doctor in New York who accepts payment cards, like for copays, when you leave the doctor's office and you got to pay your copay, that's HIPAA, that's the New York State Shield Act, that's PCI. They have a contract with Medicare and Medicaid that says they have to implement HIPAA compliance, and they have a cyber insurance policy all at the same time. So these things aren't different. Let's look at the difference between the services that you can deliver if you're not delivering them now. Everybody knows what cybersecurity is. It protects the data. And when you look down this list, that's your security stack. But compliance is different. It protects the organization. So the first thing is you have to know what the requirements are. Remember the contracts, the laws, PCI, so that everything you're doing on the left aligns with those requirements. And I said here, it should never be assumed your services automatically help with compliance. And then documentation. And the reason this is so important is whenever there's an audit, an investigation, or if somebody's sued, the first demand is always for documentation. And we're going to talk about this more when it comes to CMMC. But documentation can take as long as performing a service, and it's generally not included with what an MSP is promising to their clients, but their clients, your clients, could fail an audit, fail an investigation, or lose a lawsuit, even if you did everything right, if they don't have the documentation to prove it, and it's historical documentation. It's not saying, I want to print an encryption report out today. It's when there's an incident and a regulator takes 6 months to get around to sending the regulator or the audit letter, and it says, we want to see that all your devices were encrypted for the last 2 years. You can't do that today. When we talk about the terms in compliance, we have laws like HIPAA and state data breach laws and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. We have rules, the HIPAA Security Rule, PCI DSS for payment cards, FTC Safeguards Rule, and we comply with those by implementing a framework. So a framework is a list of cybersecurity practices. And for example, the FTC Safeguards Rule says that if you implement the NIST cybersecurity framework, you're going to be compliant with this rule. There are a couple of additional things FTC requires. Same thing with HIPAA. There are a couple of additional things that HIPAA requires, but generally we implement the frameworks. So let me give you an update on where HIPAA is. First of all, we have the security rule. And the security rule is for healthcare providers, health plans, and business associates. And a provider would be a doctor, or a dentist, or a clinic. A health plan, obviously the insurance company that provides health, or it could be a company that even self-funds its health plan. But a business associate is a company that supports healthcare and has access either to patient information or the systems that manage it. That includes MSPs, malpractice defense law firms, accountants, and billing services. You wouldn't think that an accountant would have to comply with HIPAA, but if they're auditing the books at a doctor's office, they do. There are three rules under HIPAA. So the security rule is one of three. There's the privacy rule, the breach notification rule, and the security rule. Just a warning, when you tell somebody that you do HIPAA, you should be saying the security rule, because if they ask you a question out of the privacy rule and you can't answer it, you may be the best cybersecurity person for HIPAA, but if you can't answer the privacy rule question, they may think you don't know HIPAA. HIPAA protects EPHI, or the security rule does, electronic protected health information. That's anything that's identifiable to a patient and has information about their treatment, diagnosis, or payment for health care. And it goes way back to 2005. People tell me, well, HIPAA's changing all the time. It isn't. It's the security rule came out in 2005. It was updated in 2013, and then there was a minor update in 2021. So it really hasn't changed. There have been enforcements and interpretations that have changed. The problem with the security rule is also kind of its feature. It was vague. People weren't sure, what does this mean to me? It was flexible. So a small doctor's office in the largest health system had to comply with the same rule. You have to make it vague to make it that flexible. And then they included items and they said some were required. Well, we all know what required was. But addressable said, well, if you're not doing this, you can come up with an alternate method. The problem with addressable was people kind of thought it was optional, and that caused a lot of confusion. The HIPAA security rule from 2013 was created before healthcare organizations really became reliant on technology and before many of today's threats were known. And then there was a court ruling that said some of the requirements were not clear and were not enforceable. So they've proposed a new rule just last month, January of 2025. And there are clearer requirements with specific time frames that were not in the original rule. I'm going to show you this in a minute. All practices are required. There are a couple of exceptions with some conditions, but everything is now required. So there's no question of is it optional or not. It's relevant to today's technology risk environment, and they even have discussions of AI in there and other things. So it's going to be more flexible as newer types of technology come into our world. There's more focus on implementation of these things. And again, they put timelines on this. And there's even more focus on an accurate and thorough security risk analysis, more business associate management, and more incident response requirements. These are just some of the new proposed timeframes. Now, I'm going to be clear, this is proposed. It's not in effect now, and I'll give you the timeline when we get to the end of this HIPAA presentation, but this is what the federal government is publishing as a draft, and they're asking for comments on it, but you can get an idea of what they're thinking. Create or update a risk analysis at least every 12 months. Written evaluation of making a change. Remember, this is all focused on technology before the change is made. So if you're an MSP working with a healthcare provider and they ask you to change something, move servers to the cloud or change their environment or whatever, you have to create a written document that talks about the change, what the risks are before you make it. And that's going to have to be available if they're ever audited or investigated. You have to do critical risk patching within 15 days, automated vulnerability scans at least every 6 months, pen tests annually, test incident response plans at least every 12 months, be able to restore critical systems within 72 hours. How about this next one? Remove a terminated user's access within 1 hour and ensure retrievable backups are no more than 48 hours old. They're putting guardrails around this. What they used to say was do a risk analysis and you should do patching. Now what they're saying is we want to see it within a specific time frame. Now they can't make you do that, but if they investigate an incident afterwards, or if they audit you and you're not doing that, you can be penalized. There's comprehensive cybersecurity, and I'm noting this is beyond the scope of most MSPs. When I was an MSP helping healthcare organizations, we handled their network. We handled, it was back in the day of servers and endpoint computers and routers and firewalls. But now it's all technology assets. And remember, they're using a lot of technology assets that you may not support. They may have medical devices in exam rooms that are on a network so that the medical device company can get it. or get access to it. They may have an electronic health record system where somebody in the practice is the one that adds and deletes users. So now they're saying you need to have a network inventory of all technology assets that includes a map of the movement of EPHI through every system. Now, what's unusual about this is there are other frameworks that say you need to do an inventory of all assets. And then there's another item called data flow analysis, which is how does information come into the organization, where does it go, and how does it leave? They're building that into the risk analysis now. So we're seeing some major changes here. Deploy multi-factor authentication to all technology assets. It used to be HIPAA only cared about those systems that handled protected health information. Now they're saying all assets because they realize if you, for example, as their MSP, has their passwords or your passwords to their network in a system at your end, they know that that system doesn't have protected health information, but it has the passwords to get to it. So all technology assets, this is a new change. Deploy MFA for any action that would change a user's privileges. For example, if you're the MSP and you're adding a user or you're changing their privileges, but it also means that the person that is adding the users to the electronic health record system has to use MFA, or if they're adding a user to control a medical device that you don't even manage, they have to use MFA. And then at the bottom, huge emphasis on audit trails, event logs, firewall logs, system logs, data backup logs. This was a requirement in the original HIPAA security rule, and a lot of the penalties have cited the fact there was no logging capability for this stuff. But now they're saying logs are going to be required and they're going to be looking for them, and it's part of their audit process. Business associate management. Remember I said business associates are the MSPs, the law firms that defend the medical practice in a malpractice lawsuit, accounting firms, billing firms. This again is proposed. It's not in place yet. Get written verification from the business associate every 12 months that they're compliant. That's different than just signing the business associate agreement like we did in the past and it sits out there for like 10 years. Perform and document a business associate compliance audit every 12 months. Obtain satisfactory assurances that the business associate will comply and verifies that they've deployed the technical safeguards in accordance with the regulations. Now the federal government's saying, we're looking at you, business associates. And they can audit business associates, by the way, not just healthcare providers. This next one's big because it's both a challenge, but it's a huge opportunity for you when you're working with your other business clients who aren't the healthcare providers, but the ones that support them. A written analysis of the business associates compliance would be required to be performed by a person with appropriate knowledge of and expertise with cybersecurity principles. That's you. This is an additional service you're going to be able to add. And then at their end, the business associate's going to have a senior official legally attest that they have implemented the right level of compliance. So these are your opportunities. They're requiring in this proposed law a security official, but they're saying it can be outsourced. So you could go to healthcare providers, accounting firms, law firms, anybody that qualifies as a business associate, and as part of your service. Now, in our language, in the MSP world, we call that a VCISO, Virtual Chief Information Security Officer, but you can add services onto healthcare providers and people that have to comply with these regulations to outsource that title or that status to you. And then more cybersecurity services. I hear all the time from MSPs that doctors don't want to invest in the cybersecurity. They have dentists don't want to spend any money, all this stuff. This is going to get serious if this proposed rule goes through because it's tied to Medicare payments, Medicaid payments, and there's going to be auditing. And then finally, I mentioned it before, documentation as a service is a huge opportunity for you. Here's the timeline. So we know the hard date that it was published, January 6th of this year. The public comment period ends about a month from now. And after that public comment period, there's kind of a quiet period where the Department of Health and Human Services evaluates the comments on this proposed rule because some people are saying, oh, you can't make us do MFA, our equipment doesn't support it. Well, you can't do this, you can't do that. and they'll look at those comments and decide if they want to do it. Now, what they may do is say, okay, we're not going to require MFA in 2025. We're going to require it in 2027. So the requirements out there, that gives the device manufacturers and the software vendors that may not support it time to catch up. But generally, after these rules, it's about 6 months before we see a final rule. And then when the final rule gets published, there will be a grace period for people to implement the requirements before they enforce it. So we're still looking at a year out before this would be official, if it stays with the timelines that we're used to. Anything can slip or it could be accelerated, but generally this is the timeline. So I'm going to provide this slide deck to you. If you're taking notes, or if if you're trying to take pictures with your phone or screenshots, don't do it. I'm going to send this slide deck to you. I'll give you a way to get that at the end of this presentation. Now let's switch to CMMC. Then we can go back and answer any questions about HIPAA when I'm done. First of all, I'm a CMMC certified assessor. And the reason that's important is who you listen to about CMMC matters. There are a lot of people talking about CMMC and they're saying they're CMMC authorities. They don't have certification. Some of them are what they call an RPO, a registered practitioner or a registered practitioner organization. It's not a certification course. I've taken all the registered practitioner training. I've then taken a 5-day class to become a certified CMMC professional, passed a 3.5-hour closed book test, and then did another 5 days to be an assessor with another 3.5-hour test. And I've got experience doing hundreds and hundreds of assessments. So what I'm telling you here is the information I'm giving you is credible because it's coming from authoritative sources. So what's CMMC? First of all, it stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and it affects all defense contractors. I'm going to explain the different levels in a minute. The official rule was published in its final form in December 2024. So this is now in effect, and it's expected to be in defense contracts in mid-2025, and assessments have started. The problem with CMMC compared to everything else is this is not like any other cybersecurity or compliance requirement you have ever seen before. It's new language, it's a whole new assessment process, it's a whole new ecosystem of assessors and people in the industry. And again, it's different than everything. So when you look at CMMC and go, oh yeah, well, I've helped people with HIPAA, or I've helped people with a NIST cybersecurity framework, forget that. Just take a look at CMMC as if it's something brand new, because it is. It's going to require legal attestation from the defense contractor owner, if it's a smaller business with a single owner, or a senior executive, a legal attestation under penalty of perjury. A CMMC level 2 assessment costs $30,000 to $100,000. That does not include any of the cybersecurity costs. That's just for the assessment. And the final requirements for MSPs that we thought we knew up until December of 2024 changed. So this is new information for you. And again, forget what you've heard if you listen to anything about CMMC before December of 2024, like a month and a half ago. There are 3 CMMC levels. The first thing is there's 2 types of information that are protected. Federal contract information, it's abbreviated as FCI, controlled unclassified information, which is CUI. So CMMC level 1 is for defense contractors that process, store, or transmit FCI, but not CUI. So an example might be that a company that has a contract with the defense industry to clean offices or mow the lawns may have a or may have access to the contract data, literally the information about the contract. How many, what's the quantity, or what, if they're mowing lawns, what's the frequency that it has to be done at? What's the price? That's the contract info. That's protected under CMMC level 1. Level 2 goes further, and that's for defense contractors that process, store, or transmit FCI and CUI. CUI, controlled unclassified information, is information that is not classified, okay? So it's unclassified. That's what the U stands for. but it's still something that they want to control the access to. So if you take a fighter jet, and you look at the stealth technology and the radar systems, the secret radar systems, and the weaponry, that's all classified. But there's a cockpit, and the pilot opens the cockpit to get into the plane. There's a hinge, and in the middle of the hinge, just like your bathroom door, there's a pin in the middle of the hinge. That pin, the design of it, the type of metal, the size, could be controlled unclassified information. It's not classified at the highest level, but it can't be shared. Here's what's confusing and where MSPs start to go wrong. There are 110 requirements, but there are 320 assessment objectives. I'm going to show you that in a minute. It's a third-party certification assessment every 3 years and an annual attestation by the company executive. So if your assessment's this year and you're not going to get assessed next year because you got your certification, next year your executive still going to have to legally attest that you're maintaining that level of cybersecurity in accordance with this. Then there's level 3 for defense contractors that process, store, or transmit federal contract information and especially sensitive CUI. Very few companies are going to fall into this because it's a big requirement, and they've said maybe 5% of the companies. They have to meet the level 2 requirements in the middle, and then 24 additional requirements that are for higher level threats. So the reason that this is so important to understand, first of all, yesterday an MSP that was talking to us talked about the 5 levels of CMMC. There have not been 5 levels for 3 years. So he was relying on old information. Let's look at level 1. 15 basic cybersecurity requirements, annual self-assessments and attestation by a company executive, and your MSP services, if you're the MSP supporting that company, are within the scope of their assessment. When we get to level 2, it's a whole different world. The 110 requirements, 320 assessment objectives, and there's a third-party certification assessment that your client's going to do every 3 years, an annual attestation by the company executive. It's going to cost $30,000 to $100,000, and there are more than 320 ways to fail a CMMC level 2 assessment. Now, here's something that changed from the proposed rule for CMMC to the final rule, and this was a huge change. The proposed rule, which came out at the beginning of 2024, said that if you're an MSP and you have a client that has to meet level 2, you have to go through a level 2 assessment. They took that out, but they said this: if you're an MSP and you process, store, or transmit CUI in your own systems, then you have to get a level 2 assessment. If you don't process, store, or transmit CUI in your own systems, then your services are going to be assessed as part of your client's assessment. So the first thing is, if you're storing CUI, we were talking to an MSP a couple of weeks ago who said, well, I've got my own backup solution. I'm not paying fill in the blank, all the big backup companies. We just put together our own hardware and we back our clients up to our site. I said, you might want to rethink this when it comes to the CUI data, because if you're doing that, now you're triggering yourself to buy a $30,000 to $100,000 assessment and repeat it every 3 years. Or maybe you want to find a government class backup solution, and that way you don't have to go through your own assessment. This is where MSPs are in the CMMC process. This is actually out of the level 2 scoping guide for CMMC. And it talks about security protection assets. So you are a security protection asset under the definition in CMMC. People, consultants who provide cybersecurity. So it's not just devices. When we think about assets, we're usually thinking about systems, computers or servers or cloud services. No, an asset here is a consultant. The next line: managed service provider personnel who implement system maintenance. In other words, you don't have to be a high-level cybersecurity person. You could be the person that's checking the patches every day or checking the backups. Your managed service provider personnel who implement system maintenance. network administrators, cloud-based solutions. That includes a cloud-based solution your client may use, like a planning system for the manufacturing company, but it also is your cloud solutions. So if you're using your RMM tool that's cloud-based or IT glue or something like that, it all comes into this. Hosted VPN services, SIM solutions, co-located data centers, security operations centers. And the defense contractor has to document all of this stuff, you and your tools, in their asset inventory and in their system security plan. And when they create a network diagram, it has to include you, all the services that you're providing, any other third-party cloud services they're using, going way beyond just the devices. What you have to do is, number one, deliver compliant solutions. And here, this is the big issue, because I was just at a conference not long ago, and an MSP was going, well, the government's not going to make me change my backup solution. Yeah, they are, because if you don't change it, your client's going to fail, was my answer to him. You can't use a standard commercial tool to store CUI. And that's what, when you're backing up CUI, obviously you're making a backup of production data, and the cloud service that you put it in has to be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent, and the data has to be encrypted at FIPS with FIPS 140-2 validated encryption. I don't have time to go into these definitions, but when I showed him that the cloud service he was talking about didn't qualify, all of a sudden it was a big realization I can't use the tools with CMMC that I'm using for my regular commercial customers. You have to provide your client with a customer responsibility matrix for each of the requirements in CMMC, showing them what their responsibility is and what your responsibility is, and maybe what a cloud service's responsibility is. And you have to provide them with a written description of your services. You have to validate the implementation of remember those 320 requirements, the ones that apply to your services that you handle for your client. And you have to have written procedures documented. You have to have reports and lists and audit trails, everything ready for their assessment. You're part of their assessment. You're going to need to be present at their assessment and be able to answer the assessor's questions if they have questions about the things you're taking over responsibility for. And finally, if you fail, you're the MSP, if you fail just one of the 320 assessment objectives, your client fails their assessment. There's a lot at stake here. Here's the methodology for a CMMC assessment. Examine, which means review documentation. Interview. If you review the documentation and you have a question, you're going to interview somebody. You don't substitute an interview for reviewing the documentation. 80% of a CMMC assessment is going to be documentation. And finally, test. Validate the implementation. I've had MSPs go, oh yeah, we do that. I'm just going to show the assessor. No, if you don't have all the documents that are required, you're never going to get to that point. This is the choice that an assessor has for the 320 assessment objectives. It's met or it's not met. And if it's not met, you can fail. Depends on what the requirement is, but you can immediately fail, or you may be able to put it on a plan of action and milestones and then fix it. That's only good for fewer than half of the requirements in CMMC. Let me show you the difference, just using one of the requirements. This is literally the first requirement in CMMC Level 2, authorized access control. And it says you have to limit system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users, and devices. So MSP told one of our clients, well, we're doing that. Yeah, you're all set. Except these are the 6 assessment objectives that fall under this. And there's 6 things. First of all, you have to identify authorized users, identify the authorized processes, identify the authorized devices. Then you have to show how you're limiting access to the authorized users, limiting access to the authorized processes, how you're limiting access to the authorized devices. And when it comes to what documentation requirements are, this is all straight out of the CMMC Level 2 assessment guide. Look at all these different things. Access control policy, well, that's your client's responsibility. Procedures addressing account management, that's you. How do you add somebody to their Active Directory? And you have to document that procedure. 13 documents just for the first item in CMMC. We're working with a client right now, and our client was working with an MSP who said, oh yeah, we're doing this. And we talked to the MSP and said, okay, can you prove all of these 6 things? And they go, where did that come from? We said, well, this is in the assessment guide. They thought that NIST 800-171, the practice at the top, was the requirement. They didn't know that there's an assessment guide, NIST 800-171A, or you can look at the CMMC assessment guide, which is essentially the same thing. There are 6 requirements. They didn't know you had to provide all this documentation. In fact, where you see it says under the word examine, select from, they thought they could select what they wanted to provide, when in truth, that's what the assessor is being told. This guide is for me as an assessor. Select from one of these things. If the MSP or the client can't provide one of those 13 documents, I might just fail them because I can't prove they met the requirement. Then we get to interview and test. Think of an interview as, we reviewed your documentation. We have a couple of questions. Test. Now we want you to show us something. Maybe we want to see that MFA is really required. Okay, that may or may not ever happen depending on how good the documentation is. MSPs are in the crosshairs with CMMC. You can go out and Google this MSP dumpster fire and read this article, but there are people out there, and I'm going to tell you that based on my experience with some of the MSPs who have bragged to their clients that they're helping them with CMMC, these articles aren't altogether wrong, because the MSPs are saying, oh yeah, we do CMMC, and they don't realize about that there are 320 assessment objectives. They don't realize they need to have documentation. They don't realize they can't use the regular commercial tools they're using with everybody else. So these are articles and things that are people are seeing, and the defense industry is starting to question MSPs and are you really doing this stuff? So here's how we can help. First of all, this is like a sneak preview, and we're going to come out with this stuff next month. And some of it's been existing training materials. We're repackaging it. We're going to have 3 different products for MSPs. Compliance Essentials. And this literally will help you deliver compliant services without having to learn any of the regulations within 30 days. And basically, I've come up with a list of practices that if you implement those, it's just like stopping at a stop sign. If I show you what a stop sign looks like and say, when you get to a stop sign, you stop, you look both directions, and then you go. If there's nothing coming, I can teach you what to do without having to teach you that the stop sign regulation in the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles law is this section, and here's what it says. So Compliance Essentials is helping MSPs just deliver services. That is your primary responsibility. It's what your clients expect. We're also coming out with Compliant Mastery. This is where all the policies and the procedures and the NIST cybersecurity framework and a lot of other things are detailed. This is where HIPAA and CMMC Level 1 will be. So if you want to give higher level services and like provide policies to your clients in healthcare, financial services, CMMC Level 1, state and local government, K-12 and higher ed, that's in there. And then we're doing the CMMC for MSPs. It's a separate product. It's focused on level 2. Remember, CMMC level 1 is in the compliance essentials. CMMC for MSPs is CMMC translated for MSPs. It's got a sales kit, which shows what an assessment's going to look like and what CMMC is. So there's a lot of background for somebody to be conversant in CMMC from a sales perspective, and then how to sell to the defense industry. There will be a tech kit, and the tech kit has all 110 practices and 320 assessment objectives broken down in separate videos, so you can literally 6 months or a year from now. And I've seen people go, well, we're doing a 2-day CMMC boot camp, and you're going to learn enough to deliver CMMC. This is a reference tool where when you need to go get it, you get it. When you need to have a new hire brought up to speed, you give them access to it. And it's got templates and lots of other things. The other thing is I've got a consulting company. And what we're doing is we're selling our consulting services to the defense contractors, but we get a lot of referrals from MSPs. We pay you a referral fee. We don't sell any IT products and services to compete with you. And when we're guiding your client, we're also guiding you if you're providing them with their services about what you need to do. So again, I'm going to give you a copy of this presentation. Rose's contact info is on there and you can reach out to us. Here are 2 free resources. And this is my last slide, and then we can open it up to questions and discussions. First of all, if you do either one of these things, I will send you the slide deck. So get your CMMC desktop reference guide. I wrote this guide. It's a 30-page guide. We updated it in at the end of December once we found out these new requirements for MSPs. And this is not just for MSPs. This is something you can share with your clients. It's got the Department of Defense scoring system in, what an assessment will look like. There's a link, and then there's a QR code. If you get antsy about QR codes, just use the link. And then I did a CMMC webinar in December for MSPs where it goes through CMMC, takes over an hour to go through all of CMMC. If you want to do that, it's all free. So I'll leave this up. And at this point, so Dan, do you have anything, or do you want me to just look at the questions and start answering some of the things that?
Yeah, let's jump in to the questions that we have listed there. And anybody that has questions, if you want to, you know, just, speak them, you can go ahead and just turn on your audio and speak as well.
Well, I have questions. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it, Josh.
All right.
Hey,
Mike,
Josh.
hey, so as a smaller MSP, 5-7 in my case, but 4 employees, it's
What's your weight, Josh?
195, 175 when I'm still fighting. Thanks for asking,
Okay.
Mike. I won't ask you either. So it is extremely daunting to try to dip our toes into CMMC, and it's particularly challenging because the people coming to us for this support are 5 and 10 person companies. They're $1 or $2 million businesses, and best I can tell, there's just no chance we can do that for them. So can we get them to engage with you? Have, I would presume, at least a 1-hour engagement that you can set a price for and work directly with them to basically qualify them away or into the ability to engage with us. So that's one question. The second one is, do we need to be at the same level they're at? And if I missed this, I apologize. I was out for a few minutes. Do we need to be at the same level they're at? So if they happen to be an L2 adjudicated site, do we have to be an L2? Those are my big questions.
Okay. So your first question about doing like a presentation for them is the second time in a week that an MSP has asked us to do this. It's not a service that we ever considered, but the other MSP said, look, I want them to pay for it because, first of all, it's valuable information and they'll take it more seriously than if you do it for free. We'll put something together on this. And I've already done a presentation for our training kit on the 5 answers that a business owner or executive at a defense contractor needs to know before they sign their attestation. So that's kind of our angle in doing this, saying when you're working with whether it's an internal IT department, or if you have an MSP completely outsourced, or if you're doing co-managed, all the variations in our industry, these are still the questions you want to have answered because you're literally going to sign your name on a legal document that has, false claims repercussions if you're lying. So the first thing is that, yeah, we will put together some sort of a briefing. We'll have some free materials and like that desktop reference guide, but it's 30 pages. And the message literally in the front of the book is to an owner of a defense contractor saying, I know you're not going to read this whole thing, but make sure you give it to somebody who's responsible enough to implement it. And that could be an internal person or an MSP. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. You've already talked about, these are small $1 million companies and everything. I'm just going to tell you there's 2 types of companies, those that do most of their business or a significant chunk of their business in the defense world and others that don't. If you're only doing like 3 or 5% of your revenue in the defense industry, you may decide, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to invest 30,000 in an assessment or whatever. A 5 or 10 person company would be at the lower end of that price range. I'm not going to invest 30,000 plus all the cybersecurity. I'm just going to make up more business in the commercial world and not worry about CMMC. We know that there are businesses that have thought that. Then you start getting into the ones where it's like, no, even though it may not be a majority of my revenue, it's enough that it would hurt me or put me under if I lose that business. So they're the ones that are kind of the borderline ones, you know, we're having to see what the benefits are. And then the third type would be the one that's either all or mostly defense industry. So to me, it doesn't matter if they're $1 million or $2 million. Those are kind of the qualifying questions I ask. We're seeing other industries now starting to look at similar requirements. So if you're working with Department of Homeland Security or things outside defense, they're going to have similar requirements, college financial aid offices. Your second question, do I have to be at the same level as my client? I did answer that because I said that in the proposed rule, the answer would have been yes, but they took it out of the final rule. And here's what they said about MSPs. If you are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI in your own environment, then you have to meet the same level as your client. You have to get a level 2 independent assessment. For example, if you're backing up your client,
now.
Oh, hang on.
if you're backing up your clients into your environment and you're bringing their CUI into your systems, then yes. But otherwise, if you're not, then your services are being assessed as part of your client's requirement. And that means that when your client's being audited, you're being audited. So when you say, do you have to be at the same level? When the client outsources a task, so let's look at the first requirement. You have to limit access to authorized individuals. Just that very first part of the requirement. Well, there's two requirements in that. First of all, who authorizes the individuals? That's the client. You don't authorize the individual. You get an email or a call from a client who says, I just hired, you know, Josh Lieberman, and I need you to give him access, and here's his role. So make sure you give him the right access to those, you know, based on that role. But they're the only ones that can do that. So even that first requirement is a shared responsibility with the client. Now, access establishment is what you're doing for them. You're setting up the access for that person. So you're going to have to document your procedures for how you do that. You're going to have to show evidence like the user lists that are current. You're going to have to show what users are enabled, are disabled, or expired. You know, that when you look at an Active Directory, those are, you know, generally the categories of users. And that's data that because you handle that requirement, you're going to have to provide. So it's basically saying, yes, your services are going to be assessed. You're not paying for it. That's the big difference. Your client is paying to have your services assessed because they outsourced them to you. Did that answer your questions?
I kind of have a question on that. So, like, if you store a single password for something in your client's environment, doesn't that bring you in?
No,
Store it on-
this was no, it's a great question because this was in the original version of CMMC, the proposed rule, and it was taken out in the final rule. And it wasn't taken out clearly. So here's what they said. CUI, controlled unclassified information, we know what it is, okay? And because it has to be marked. It's supposed to be marked as CUI. So if you get a document that says it's CUI, we know that that has what the level of protection is. But then they had another category of data called SPD, security protection data. Security protection data would be that password. It could be the results of a vulnerability scan. It could be whatever configuration information you have in IT glue or something like that. I'm just using that as an example. Of course, any of the products I talk about, we're not like endorsing or anything. So they originally said that all that data would have to be in a FedRAMP moderate cloud and protected with FIPS 140-2 validated encryption. They took it out of the final rule. Now, when you look at the different types of data, if it's CUI, it has to be in a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud and encrypted with FIPS 140-2 validated encryption. That's why the backups qualify, because they're replications of CUI in a production environment. Your security protection data, no longer FedRAMP, no longer encryption, but those systems will be evaluated to make sure that they're encrypted, that all the normal things that are required for level 2, they meet. It's a different requirement. The first requirement, the proposed one, was going to blow up the whole MSP industry, because none of the RMM tools, none of the PSA tools, none of the vulnerability scanners would have met the requirement, or the SIM solutions, or the SOC as a service. Now they're still going to be part of the assessment, but it doesn't require those additional things.
Okay. The other thing I was wondering about is when the CEO is attesting, they seem like they would be in the position of the least amount of knowledge as to whether a firewall has MFA on it, for example. So are they attesting to the fact that they hired people to do this, or what exactly are they attesting to?
No, go back to your firewall example. When they attest, if there's a requirement says the firewall must have MFA,
Yep.
there isn't a specific requirement like that. I'm just using your example. When they attest, they're attesting that their firewall has MFA. You're right about them not having the knowledge, but here's why that requirement is in there, because this way they can't blame the IT guy / MSP. Well, I didn't know anything about it. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Enron Corporation,
Oh yeah.
the big
Oh yeah.
scandal. Okay. The big scandal there wasn't IT, it was finances. But the CEO said, hey, I'm not an accountant. I don't know any of that crap that I signed off on. CFO told me to sign this, I signed it. Well, with Enron, it all changed, and it's changed across different industries. Now they're making the boards of directors liable. They're making the senior executives liable because it's happening on their watch. And I don't know if you remember this from last year, when there was the big Change Healthcare breach, which was also known as the United Healthcare breach, because Change was a division of United. The CEO, his name was Whitty, went to the Senate and said, and testified in front of the senators after this huge breach, that their policies required them to implement MFA and they hadn't done it. That was in his Senate testimony. And this is why the regulators, and in this case, the Department of Defense, are requiring business owners and executives. This is your business. You need to hire the right people. If you don't have the right people, or if you're not doing the right things and you sign this, you're under penalties under the Federal False Claims Act. So this is a big deal. Now, this is why MSPs are referring our company to come in and work with their clients to show them these things and say to an owner, using your example, let me show you that there's MFA on this firewall. And here's the evidence that we have to prove it. And as an assessor, based on my training, I would accept this evidence when I'm shown it. Now, here's one of the big things about the final audit with CMMC. Remember, you paid your 30,000 or your 100,000, wherever you fit in the size and scale of the audit, of the assessment. And the assessor says, you didn't meet this requirement. And you say, what do I need to do to fix it? They're not allowed to tell you. In a final assessment, think of it as a World Series baseball game. The umpire calls balls and strikes. The umpire doesn't tell the batter, you should hold the bat in a different position, doesn't tell the pitcher, you should throw a little more to the inside or outside. They're calling balls and strikes. That's in the final assessment. When we do a mock assessment, first of all, it excludes me from being on the team for the final assessment. As an assessor, I can't do both. But in a mock assessment, we show the client, you failed this. Now, we don't use fail. You didn't meet this requirement, and here's what you need to do to fix it. Let's do those things, and then we'll come back and reassess you. That's where our consulting comes in, to make that executive comfortable that it's okay to sign off.
Yeah, by bringing that up, you actually touched on the next thing I wanted to ask. So obviously, you can't implement the security and audit yourself. So
Well,
you're always going to be hiring third-party auditors. You're going to try to get everything
let me go
ready
back.
for that.
But let me go back to the three different levels of CMMC. Level one, where they're only doing FCI, and there's something like 100,000 companies out there that only need level one. They need to implement those 15 requirements. Doesn't sound like a lot. And they're basic requirements that you would do for, I would think, for every one of your clients anyway. But that's a self-assessment with a legal attestation. So at level one, you can implement the 15 requirements, you can develop the documentation, show the owner at the client that, here's the evidence to prove we've done these things. It's okay to sign your attestation. Essentially, you are self-assessing because you're providing the service and you're showing them, here's how it meets the assessment requirements. That's CMMC level one. As level two ramps up, they're doing it over a 4-year period. So not every contract the first year is going to have CMMC level two in it. They're going to allow some level two contractors to self-assess. So it's the same kind of thing where in this case, you could assess yourself. But to be honest, based on my experience with MSPs who have told their clients they're doing things and we found out it didn't meet the requirements, there's a huge difference between you as an MSP thinking something's good enough to pass and me as an assessor knowing the CMMC rules in and out, knowing what the documentation requirements are, and knowing, what the assessment process needs to be to pass. So this is where, that's why on the CMMC level two, eventually after the 4-year ramp up, everybody's going to need an independent assessment so you aren't assessing yourself.
Okay.
Keep them
Um,
coming. You're asking good
Go ahead,
questions.
Mike.
Yeah, I know. One more, if that's right. I know we're at the top of the hour. Um,
No, go for it.
for the cost side of it, like I've had clients that have had to meet different government requirements, not CMMC, but for their particular branch, and I've had to add like Blue Mira to their environment. So that's like $10 a user a month, and that covers the logging requirement and stuff. Um, do you have an idea of roughly what the security stack that you need to add to your services is going to add to it, to their cost?
Well, it's kind of asking how much rope does it take to tie a horse to a fence, right? I mean, that answer is so variable based on what the services are, what you're charging now, if you're at $300 a seat or $100 a seat and so forth. But here's kind of what I did. Let me go back 20 years when I moved into the compliance business. We knew even 20 years ago, the documentation was going to be really important to provide to a client. So simply printing out the monthly firewall reports and the monthly patching reports and all that stuff from our existing systems, not changing any of the stuff we're using, just printing out those reports is going to take us almost as long as it did over the course of a month to service the client. We just doubled our rates. And by positioning them as compliance requirements, we said this: if you just want the cybersecurity, that's fine, stay at the same rate. If you want to be able to pass the audit, then you're going to need our monthly reports. You're going to need all the documentation. You're going to need the policies. You're going to need our procedures documented. And here's what that costs. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. But when the audit comes, you have to figure out how you're going to come up with that. Well, they can't, because those are your procedures. Those are your reports out of your PSA or your RMM or your IT glue or your patching or your vulnerability system. They can't do it for themselves. So the first thing is, if you're selling CMMC compliance services, reset your brain and say, this is not a cybersecurity service. This is an assessment service. This is an audit service. And I don't know, for example, what the difference in cost would be. So one of the examples is that you're going to have to move your clients if they're CMMC level 2 and they get CUI and they have to communicate it within their company out of a Microsoft standard commercial environment into Microsoft Government Cloud, GCC. That can cost twice as much right there. But then to answer your question, I don't know what you're charging them now and how you're charging them for that
Right.
type of thing.
I
So,
had, yeah, I had one that, they were going for a state contract that had some unique requirements because it was for insurance fraud investigations. I looked at all the stuff and I said, okay, $700 a month more in addition because I'm adding this logging thing, this vulnerability scanning and all that. And they're like, the contract's not worth that much. And I'm looking at some of these things like you're saying, $30,000 at a minimum, and I'm like, yeah, I wonder how many of them are just going to nope out of it because,
well, so take that exact question right there. It's a great question. If there are 10 companies that are providing a service or providing a product, and 6 of them say, it's not worth it for me. Now there are only 4. What do you think's going to have to do with the prices for the Department of Defense? The DoD recognizes that they're going to pay more for their products and services because of CMMC. Now, obviously, if you have a contract in place right now, you can't go back and retroactively change the numbers. But if you're the defense contractor, your client that we're talking about that said it's not worth $700 a month, $700 a month, $8,400 a year. I have no idea what their contracts are. They could add $8,400 in additional expenses. I mean, they still have to be competitive in the marketplace. But if everybody's doing that and they have to recover their CMMC costs, they can recover them in their pricing. It's not expected to be absorbed for free. What they're saying is, when you send us your next proposal or you bid on the next contract, using your example, I would add $1,000, add $12,000 on it. That covers the $700 a month plus there's a little more, on top of that. Now, don't forget they have to win the bid. I get that, but they can incorporate those costs into what they're charging. This whole thing, because I've heard it from defense contractors, well, we have to eat this. No, you don't. Add the costs for CMMC into your contracts and let the government pay for it. I'm telling you the same thing. Add the costs of helping your client comply with CMMC into your fees so they pay for it.
Mhm.
So if it's not worth $700 a month, do you have any idea how many dollars a year they do with the DoD?
this one wasn't with the DoD, but actually I don't even know what the contract was, if it was on a flat fee for the year or if it was this many dollars per individual that you investigate. I don't know how that contract worked out. So I don't know how realistic that was to say they didn't want to do it because of that, or if they were just blowing smoke, and I don't know.
Well, I don't know how they make business decisions. The irony is maybe they decided not to bid and somebody else bid and were $12,000 a year more than they were to cover all their costs of doing what your client didn't want to do, and they won the deal. So that's a
Yeah,
business decision.
right.
But one of the things that we've seen, so the other thing that I didn't talk about today is that there's a new rule proposed at the federal level to expand CUI protection to other agencies. CUI is not just defense. The Department of Homeland Security, college financial aid offices get what they call FTI, federal tax information. They've already been told you should expect to implement NIST 800-171, which is the basis for CMMC. So we are going to see this across other industries. But my message to you is, if you increase your rates, you have to tell your client, this isn't just an increase you eat. This is one you're going to pass along because the DoD, Department of Defense, is making you do it. Charge them more.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, I
Okay.
know we're going into overtime, which is okay because compliance is critical, and there was a lot of great information. Does anybody have any final questions? There was one question. Andre had. Let me see if Andre's still. Yes, Andre's still here. I know one of Andre's questions was answered, but the other one was, are we currently seeing any more
Enforcement before then. Yeah, that's what I was wondering for all those, like you said, dentists out there.
Yeah. Yep.
So a funny thing about Dennis, I was at a HIPAA conference. I was speaking at a national HIPAA conference, and the head of the Office for Civil Rights that enforces HIPAA was there, and he did a question and answer thing. And I walked up to the microphone and I said, why do dentists think they have diplomatic immunity from HIPAA? And he laughed and he looked at one of his people. He says, well, I can't tell you, but we're investigating some right now. And if you go back through the HIPAA penalties, you'll see a bunch of them against dentists. But I mean, dentists are notoriously cheap and difficult to deal with, and don't think that the rules apply to them. The problem with dentists, and I think this is where it's going to, reach its pinnacle, is that dentists, a lot of them accept a lot of Medicaid money because their people are lower income. Medicare is for older Americans, Medicaid is for lower income Americans. And if they're accepting Medicaid payments in their contract, there's a requirement to implement HIPAA. So if they don't do that, and they don't want to implement that cybersecurity, now they have to get caught. Okay, it's not automatic. But if there's an audit or if there's an investigation and a whistleblower can turn them in and get 30% of the penalty, they would have to pay back 3 times what the government paid them. So if they're doing $1 million a year in Medicaid and they get caught in a False Claims Act lawsuit, which is triggered by a whistleblower, could be you, could be their office manager, could be somebody that has a grudge against them, turns them in for this, they would have to pay back 3 times what Medicaid pay them. So that's writing a $3 million check, and that's not like a payment plan. You write a $3 million check, and then the whistleblower can get 30% of it, which is $900,000 for turning them in. And then they can be banned from future Medicaid payments. So when we talk about doctors and dentists, and they don't like HIPAA, I always say, let's change the conversation. Do they like money? And do they want to not pay, $3 million and have their former office manager who they fired get a
Right.
$900,000 reward? So I see
Andre,
Andre's got his hand up.
yeah, he's got his hand up. Go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, hey, Mike, hey, Dan.
Hey.
Mike just quipped in what I was going to say. Thanks for the information. I was going to say thanks for the go-to-market strategy, Mike. What you just said. find
You're
out
welcome.
find out if they're Medicaid providers, and go from there. But yeah, the other Mike he put a chat in there, and he said something that I was thinking, because yeah, whistleblowers. I think there's some new regulations on that, new
Yeah.
opportunities on that. But that's a good idea. But I appreciate it. Yeah, that was one of the things I've always thought about on the consulting side as far as HIPAA, because it doesn't seem like there's much enforcement until there's an actual incident. So they can procrastinate until something bad happens, unfortunately.
That's been true. I'll also tell you that if you've got somebody that literally doesn't care about compliance or they don't care about cybersecurity, you're putting some skin in the game here, because if they get caught and they get into something, you could get dragged into it. And we fired a client once because they told us, we're not going to implement any of that stuff. We'll just do enough that our insurance will cover us. We're not going to meet the regulations. I fired him. This was a big health clinic. And the office manager, what do you mean you're firing us? I said, we're not renewing with you. And the reason for it is, if they didn't implement the cybersecurity and they had an incident, I would end up in court testifying against my client. The
Yeah.
first thing is, who's paying for that? And when all the evidence demands come, they're going to call me and say, oh, the lawyers are demanding these reports and those reports and all this stuff. So we built into our contract, and like I said, I'm not an MSP anymore, I'm a consultant. We will provide up to 8 hours of advice for an incident. Anything above that's billable at hourly rates, which is like $300 an hour, because I'm not doing this cheap when they're paying a lawyer, $500 or $1,000 an hour to defend them. And more than that, I just don't want to be dragged into their shitstorm, if you'll pardon me using that term. That's their problem. So my suggestion is, don't give up business and put yourself in financial trouble. Go find enough good business that when the time comes, you can just say to somebody, go find someone else. And when they ask you who it is, you just tell them, or you tell them this is somebody that can help you. And you don't tell them it's your worst competitor that you want to dump them on so that the
Yeah.
competitor has all the heartbreak and
Well,
the
I mean,
risk.
we know the saying that all revenue is not good revenue, and I think unfortunately, um, you know, we see way too many situations where people are eager. It's like, well, that's revenue. I can't drop that. But if they're not taking this seriously and they're going to put not only themselves at risk, they're putting you at risk, is it really worth it? And the answer is no. And
I mean, to
it's
your
a
point, Dan, is selling drugs is revenue too, right?
right, exactly,
What are you going
exactly.
to do it?
Yeah, right.
No,
You
I mean,
know,
yeah,
yeah, and and I think unfortunately, um, the almighty dollar, is sometimes something difficult to say. I need to cut them, and but we need to stay strong and be strong, and as I tell my children, do what's right and avoid what's wrong, and you've got to make a decision as a it's a business decision, um, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. A lot of great information. Mike, I want to point out that your shirt is awesome. That complianceologist, that is very cool. I don't know if I've seen that before. Is that something new? I haven't.
yeah. We've kind of gone to that branding, and the reason for it is when you go to your regular doctor and the doctor sees something, they'll refer you to an ologist, a dermatologist, a
Yeah,
radiologist, a cardiologist, or whatever. So I'm that person. I specialize in compliance and cybersecurity, and I'm not just like another MSP that says we're
yeah,
doing compliance and here's what it is. I'm certified. I've literally written certification courses for HIPAA, for cyber resilience, for the Disaster Recovery Institute. uh, this whole CMMC certification thing was crazy because it kept changing. And I've met all the requirements. I've got my CMMC certified professional, certified assessor. I had to get another compliance certification called CGRC for governance, risk, and compliance. And I had to have a tier 3 Department of Defense background check, which took 10 months, which was a lot longer than my FBI background check. So there's a lot to this. And I'll just
yeah.
warn everybody, I put my email in here. If you have questions, send them, because there's a lot of bad information out there by people or from people who are not CMMC certified, but they're talking a big game.
Yep. So we've, I've thrown in the chat both here in Zoom, but also out on YouTube, the links to the guides that you can download that Mike provided. I've also included Mike's LinkedIn, and Mike's also provided his email address. So, with that being said, Mike, thank you so much for your time and knowledge. As always, we love the passion that you have, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge with our community. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Your success is my success. It's that simple.
That's awesome. And everybody have a great day. And one last shameless plug, if you didn't see in chat, this call every Wednesday, we have a different business function expert every Wednesday for WTF Wednesdays. And then on Friday, it's in chat, but if you go to everythinmsp.com under resources, we have our MSP discussion group each Friday at 12 noon Eastern time, where many of the same people and others are joining us. We talk about successes, challenges, and any kind of changes that are occurring in the channel each Friday at noon Eastern time. So be sure to join us for that as well. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.